Hi class, I hope you're each doing well. Welcome to our second video in this module on the development of human sexuality. This is our video on sexuality and sexual orientation. In this video, you're going to be learning about Kinsey's research on sexuality, and you'll also be learning about Kinsey's continuum of sexuality and Diamond's theory of sexual fluidity. You'll also be learning about research on the origins of sexual orientation, and you'll be learning about the progression of attitudes on homosexuality. And then you'll be looking at the process of disclosing one's sexual orientation. So let's get started. Most people view heterosexuality and homosexuality as two distinct categories. What do you think? Is it more accurate to view them as endpoints on a scale? Lisa Diamond, who's cited in your textbook and who is a very famous researcher known for her decades-long research on sexual minority women, has come up with a term called sexual fluidity. She describes this as an individual's capacity for fluctuation in their sexual response, and that this results from different situations or interpersonal and contextual experiences. Now, to date, researchers have most often explored this concept with respect to sexual orientation and to the gender to which individuals are sexually and romantically attracted. One big debate, though, has been whether or not sexual fluidity is distinct from bisexuality, or the capacity to be sexually attracted to more than just one gender. Within the literature on sexual fluidity, a variety of experiences have been explored, and these include sexual behavior that differs from one's stated sexual identity, changes in attraction or behavior over the lifespan, or specific situational contexts that are associated with sexual behaviors and attraction that differs from a previously stated sexual identity. So Diamond questions whether all of these examples are part of one overarching concept, that concept of sexual fluidity. But she's also questioned whether they may be better thought of as separate constructs or subtypes of sexual fluidity. So what do you think? Do you think that sexual attraction can change based on context and situational factors? Do you think that sexual orientation rests on a continuum ranging from exclusively homosexual, then varying levels in between, to exclusively heterosexual? Or do you think of heterosexuality and homosexuality as two distinct categories? Kinsey and many other sex researchers view heterosexuality and homosexuality as ends of a continuum rather than an all or none distinction. So you can see here this 7-point scale, and this was created by Kinsey. And the scale ranges from here, as you see, 0 to 6 for describing sexual orientation. So I wonder, what do you think about this continuum? Do you think that this is an accurate representation of sexual behavior? Let's now take a look at Kinsey's research on sexual behavior. As many of you would probably agree, there are many people who have a lot of difficulty talking about sex, sexuality, and any issues that are related to sexual behavior. So given the difficulty that people have talking about sex, even within their closest relationships, it probably won't surprise you that it wasn't until fairly recently in the study of human behavior in the 1940s that the serious scientific inquiry of sexuality began. And we can thank Alfred Kinsey for his pioneering work in sex research. He chose to examine human sexuality despite the popular taboo nature of this topic. Kinsey and his colleagues were pretty controversial, yet his research at Indiana University paved the way for decades of sex research. So Kinsey surveyed thousands of men and women about their sexual habits and their histories, And he asked questions about sexual preferences, sexual behavior, what happened in the bedroom, premarital sex, and he asked questions such as, were you a virgin when you got married? And how often do you have sex? And have you ever had an extramarital affair? Or how many sexual partners have you had? And so these were questions that at the time people thought were pretty controversial. So he wrote 2 texts on sexual behavior. And despite the dry nature of the scientific writing, they became bestsellers. Why? Well, for the first time, people could see what was happening outside of their own bedroom. One of the most interesting things that he found was that the popular perception of what people do sexually, what we may think people do, was quite different from what people actually do. Several people were critical of Kinsey's research. So if you'll remember what you learned about research involving surveys, the sample has to be representative of the population in order for the results to be generalizable. So the population is the entire group in which the researcher is interested in. And many early sexual behavior studies, including those of Kinsey, relied on volunteer samples. They were all white, they were better educated, and perhaps most importantly for the conclusions, they were all willing to talk openly about their sexuality. The people who were interviewed didn't represent all the people in the population, and a number of studies have since shown that volunteers tend to be more sexually experienced, more sensation-seeking, more unconventional, and they tend to have more relaxed sexual attitudes and behavior than those who are randomly recruited from the general population. Another key challenge for all sex survey research is developing methods that will reduce problems associated with the way that questions are asked, inaccuracies of memory, and respondents' willingness to honestly report sensitive attitudes and behaviors. Take a look at these research results, for example. Fisher and Alexander surveyed over 200 unmarried heterosexual college students who were 18 to 25 years of age. One group filled in questionnaires, having been told that the researcher might view their responses. Then, a second group filled in the survey completely anonymously alone in a room. And a third group had electrodes placed on their hand, forearms, and neck, and were told that they were being attached to a polygraph or lie detector machine, although there was in fact no working machine. Women who thought that their responses might be read said that they had an average of 2.6 sexual partners, compared with 3.4 partners for those who thought their answers were anonymous. But those who thought that they'd be caught out by the polygraph reported an average of 4.4 partners. Now, in contrast, men's answers did not vary significantly. Those attached to the lie detector reported an average of 4 partners compared with 3.7 for men who thought their answers would be read. So we live in a culture that really does expect a different pattern of sexual behavior from women than it does from men, according to Fisher, the researcher. Despite the problems that I've outlined, Kinsey's work is incredibly important. He adopted a scientific approach to studying sex at a time when others thought that it was not an appropriate topic for scientific research. Let's now take some time to look at what contributes to sexual orientation. Freud attributed homosexuality to an unresolved Oedipus complex where the child identifies with the parent of the opposite gender. And some have suggested that it's caused by poor relationships with same-gendered peers or from childhood labels of being homosexual. But there's very little support, if any, for these views. Many gay men and women trace homosexual leanings to early childhood. So many theorists propose that sexual orientation is more likely caused by biological factors. And that's what we're going to be looking at now, what the research supports. Sexual orientation describes the patterns of sexual, romantic, and emotional attraction, and one's sense of identity that's based on those attractions. Sexual orientation is distinct from gender identity, the internal sense of being male, female, or non-binary. I think it's important for us to develop a common vocabulary because this can help to foster inclusive and productive discussions about sex and gender. So, what is it that contributes to sexual orientation? Well, the available research suggests that genetic factors contribute to sexual orientation for both men and women. So if we look at twin studies suggest that homosexuality is more prevalent among monozygotic, in other words, identical twins, than dizygotic or fraternal twins. So this suggests a genetic relationship since identical twins share identical DNA. Overall, the research suggests, though, that while genetics influence sexual orientation, the degree of this influence is still not known. So the data on genetics, though, raises an evolutionary question that some people may have. How could a gene that increases homosexuality be widespread? Any gene that decreases the probability of reproducing becomes rare. Well, one hypothesis is that homosexual people who have no children of their own might help their brothers and sisters to rear children, thus passing on some of their genes. And another possibility here is that sexual orientation depends on epigenetics, meaning that it depends upon the activation or inactivation of a gene rather than something that's in our genes that's already set. Another factor in sexual orientation that's biological but not genetic, and this is hormones. And that's prenatal sex hormones. And so it's thought that prenatal sex hormones may have an effect on the brain. And we know that they do, but in terms of sexual orientation. And so when researchers have looked at the brains of homosexuals and heterosexuals, they have found some small differences in brain structure and function. And so this exposure to prenatal hormones is directly related to higher than average or higher than typical levels of testosterone potentially during certain periods of prenatal development. I think it's also interesting to point out that the probability of having a homosexual orientation is slightly elevated among men who have an older brother. Having an older sister doesn't seem to make a difference, nor does having an older adopted brother. It also doesn't make any difference whether the older brother lived in the same house with the younger brother or somewhere else. What seems to matter is whether the mother had previously given birth to another son. And one hypothesis to explain this tendency is that the first son sometimes causes the mother's immune system to build up antibodies that may alter the development of later sons. And as I said, it's also possible that prenatal sex hormones influence later sexual orientation. So where does all of this leave us? Well, the evidence points to both genetics and prenatal environment, which probably alter certain aspects of the brain anatomy in some small ways. But I think there's a lot still to be known. That's what, a lot of researchers suggest that there's a lot still that needs to be known about the interactions that happen between experiences and these biological factors. In this image, you'll see a depiction of the relationship between genetics and sexual orientation. So a concordance rate indicates the percentage of twin pairs or other pairs of relatives that exhibit the same characteristics. So if relatives who share more genetic relatedness show higher concordance rates than relatives who share less genetic overlap, this evidence suggests that there's a genetic predisposition to the characteristic. And studies of both gay men and lesbian women have found higher concordance rates among identical twins than fraternal twins, who in turn exhibit more concordance than their adoptive siblings. So these findings are consistent with the hypothesis that genetic factors influence sexual orientation. Now, if only genetic factors were responsible for sexual orientation, then the identical twin concordance rates would push to 100%. But because they're much lower, then there are additional factors that may also play a role that you just learned about. Gender identity is one sense of being male or female, or somewhere in between on the continuum of being male and female. And in most cases, our gender identities correspond with our biological sex, but not always. And for some people who may not have a correspondence between their biological sex and their gender identity, they may experience gender dysphoria. And many of you may have heard of gender dysphoria, as perhaps you have heard about transgender experiences. And so gender dysphoria is a feeling of disconnection, of feeling very uncomfortable or having discomfort or distress that surrounds the conflict between the gender one is assigned at birth and the gender that one identifies as. So, in other words, individuals with gender dysphoria often feel as though the gender that they are inside, their personal gender identity, doesn't match with the gender that they're on the outside, and they experience significant distress from this feeling. And so this often motivates people who struggle with this to make changes in their lives to address their symptoms. And this might include changes in behavior, appearance, interactions with others, and transitioning to a different gender socially or through surgery. And for many individuals who struggle with gender dysphoria, symptoms start during childhood. And even though this happens, though, it can actually be difficult to diagnose gender dysphoria in children. So children may, and this is because children can experience symptoms they experience them often differently from adults, especially since they may have a harder time clearly expressing and understanding their emotions. And it might also be difficult to determine which behaviors indicate gender dysphoria and which behaviors are a typical part of the child's identity changing and maturing. As I share this with you, some of you may want to know more about what it means to be transgender. Many of you may already know about what it means to be transgender, but I just want to make sure that you do know about this. So the American Medical Association actually defines transgender as the broad spectrum of individuals who transiently or persistently identify with a gender different from their gender at birth. So in simpler language, the term transgender refers to someone who identifies with a different gender than the one that they were born as or assigned at birth. So the term transgender isn't reserved for those who transition from one gender to another, though. It can also include those who don't fit neatly into a gender binary or fall somewhere between genders. And each person who is transgender is individually different. And it's important not to generalize an entire demographic, just like this would be true with any individual who has a certain trait. We would not want to generalize that individual based upon that trait or draw assumptions that all people with that trait have a lot of similarities. So when we think about gender, gender is very complex, and it actually can be, for many people, quite fluid. And remember, all transgender people don't express themselves in the same way. Someone might decide to transition socially, and some might decide to transition physically, or perhaps a combination of both. And some might not want to transition publicly, and some might change how they transition over time. And what we need to keep in mind that it's important that we are, as individuals, supportive and respectful of the decisions that others make. So as I'm sharing this with you, you might then ask yourself, what is the difference between gender dysphoria and transgender? So having gender dysphoria does not mean necessarily that an individual is transgender. The majority of people who are transgender typically struggle with gender dysphoria. It's not uncommon, but these two are not mutually exclusive. Gender dysphoria can be felt at different points in a person's life as they begin to develop and come to terms with their own identities. And gender nonconformity can also coincide with gender dysphoria feelings, which might make a person seem transgender. But what's important overall is not deciding whether or not a person is transgender. It is instead how that person chooses to identify. I have an example. This is from your textbook, and this is from figure 10.9. And this is Chaz Bono, who's a transgender male and a well-known person who transitioned from female to male. And in the 1970s, everyone knew Chaz as Chastity Bono, who was the daughter of Sonny and Cher. And later in life, Chaz transitioned to align his physical body with his gender identity. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now looking at the attitudes towards sexual minorities. And this is important for many reasons. It's important just for us as individuals to know about the effects of any attitudes we may have on people who are sexual minorities. And then it's also so important when we think about helping professions like people who work in healthcare and people who work in mental health care. Because when people experience discrimination or prejudice based upon any feature, including sexual orientation, this can have a significant effect on one's physical and mental health. And it can also have an effect on one's safety. So, for much of our nation's history, the vast majority of people, as many of you know, have disapproved of homosexuality so strongly that for much of our history, anyone who came out would generally experience difficulty and would even risk danger. But over the past 30 years, there have been some very rapid changes in these attitudes. If we go back to 1988, there was a survey called the General Social Survey that asked a question about same-sex marriage, and only 11.6% of respondents said that they thought same-sex couples should have the right to marry. But by 2018, 30 years later, the number of Americans who said same-sex couples should have the right to marry was at 68%. Then we have a very important research study that examined implicit bias. And you'll remember what implicit bias is from an earlier module where you were asked to visit the Harvard Implicit Bias website and to examine your own implicit biases. And so they found that there was a 33% drop in anti-gay implicit bias over the past several years. So I wonder, what do you think is causing this shift that we've seen over the past 30 years? Well, there are many reasons for this shift, but some researchers suggest that one factor is that gay people are more visible today than they were before. But as we think about this, we have to think about how an increase in positive attitudes towards people who are sexual minorities can have an effect on people coming out as being a sexual minority. And so there seems to be a reciprocal effect here. As people have better attitudes, we see more people being open. As more people are open about their sexual orientation, then we see more positive attitudes. Now, granted, this is only one of many factors, but it is an important factor according to some researchers. So, how has this happened? Well, in the 1980s and 90s, as many of you know, many gay people came out in response to a health crisis that many of you are very aware of, and that's the AIDS crisis. And this is a crisis that at the time was claiming the lives of tens of thousands of people. And while this crisis, the AIDS crisis, affected people of various sexual orientations, this served somewhat as an impetus for many people who were gay to be open about their sexual orientation. A movement that was already in existence among many people who were gay, but was still not very large, involved organizing efforts to be treated equally in society and to have equal rights. And an important part of this movement in its success was sharing the language of marriage, using a vocabulary of shared values that included love and commitment and family and inclusion. And so this shared vocabulary helped many people who were not gay to better understand who gay people really are and to see the importance of equality not only in marriage, but in everything. However, while we have seen these important attitudinal changes and this progress, there is still a significant amount of room for growth. So, as you see here on the slide that I have in front of you, being a sexual minority can result in increased stress. This can then increase one's risk for developing depression and for having anxiety. So, I'd like to go back for a moment to help you to think about how the effects of sexual orientation and discrimination, I should say, in relation to sexual orientation have contributed to some of these very negative outcomes that are uniquely high among people who are sexual minorities. So if we look at, for example, just in recent history, it wasn't until 2015, so just very recent, that a federal judge ruled that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects sexual minorities from employment discrimination. So think about this. This means that employment discrimination is something that people prior to 2015 were overtly experiencing. And actually, in 31 states, from what I've recently read, there's still no law that protects employment for people who identify as transgender. So employment discrimination is just one issue, though. We can think too about rights surrounding relationships and parenting and schooling and using public spaces like restrooms and how this can create stressful situations. So there were some very important studies that have shown some very clear effects of the stress that sexual minorities experience. So there was a study that was published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2016. And this study, I think you'll find this cited in many textbooks, found that sexual minorities are more likely to attempt suicide during their lifetimes. And in this analysis that was published in this journal, they combined data from 30 different studies, including a total of more than 21,000 sexual minority adults. And of course, the results of these studies varied in their methodologies. What they found was that 20% of sexual minority adults have attempted suicide. By comparison, 4% of the general public attempt suicide. Another important study that was published in the International Review of Psychiatry found that adults who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual suffer from depression at significantly higher rates than those who identify as heterosexual. And the risks are even higher for homosexual and bisexual youth. Now, this study included 199 studies investigating the mental health of sexual minorities compared to heterosexual people. And 98% of the studies, of these 199 studies, found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, and even those who are questioning their sexuality, are at an increased risk for attempting suicide. There's also evidence that sexual minorities suffer from anxiety disorders at a higher rate and are more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs compared to heterosexual people. So challenges such as the stigma that is associated with sexual minorities, discrimination, family disapproval, social rejection, and violence, these are the factors that can lead to mental health problems. So clearly we can say that these are very important issues that we need to address. It is wonderful. It's great that we've seen such significant changes in attitudes towards people who are sexual minorities. But we still have a lot of room for growth if we want to have a positive effect on reducing the rates of depression and anxiety and suicide attempts among sexual minorities. Sexual identity development involves acknowledging, recognizing, and labeling one's sexual orientation. However, people vary in how, when, and to whom they disclose their sexual orientation. In one research study, sexual minority men reported that some of the reasons for not disclosing their sexual orientation to others included the anticipation of negative emotional reactions, anticipation of negative changes in relationships, the belief that others held stigmatizing attitudes towards homosexuality, prior experiences with negative reactions to disclosure, wanting to maintain others' perceptions of them, fear that those who they would disclose this to would tell additional people, and the fear of rejection due to religion or culture. In a study that I came across that was conducted by the Yale School of Public Health, researchers estimated that about 83% of those who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual keep their orientation hidden from all people in their lives. Now, this is a global rate. This is not in the US. This is around the globe. So 83% of people who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual around the world keep their orientation hidden from all or most people in their lives. Now, in this same study, the researchers found that eliminating structural stigma at the country level would dramatically reduce the size of the percentage of people concealing their sexual identity from 83% globally to about 16%. So I ask you, what do you think we can do as a society to reduce the stigma? While we are much further ahead than many places throughout the world, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made. So what can we do individually? What can we do as a community? And what can we do as a country to positively address this very important issue? What have you learned in this video? You learned about Kinsey's research on sexuality and the strengths and challenges associated with his research. You also learned about Kinsey's continuum of sexuality and Diamond's theory of sexual fluidity. You also learned about research on the origins of sexual orientation and the connection between sexual orientation and biology. You also learned about the progression of attitudes on homosexuality. And you learned about the process of disclosing one's sexual orientation. As always, if you have any questions after reading your textbook or watching these videos, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I look forward to seeing each of you online.